Can you review the X modifiers implemented January 1st, 2015? Honestly, there really hasn't been that much of a change. In fact, CMS Medicare hasn't given us much feedback or examples that consultants and coders have been looking for. But these new modifiers, XE, XP, XS, and XU, were created to define subsets of modifier 59, which describes the distinct procedural services. And that just basically means that Medicare had overpaid 40% of claims because of misuse of modifier 59. So they created these very explicit X codes. But I have a feeling that ICD-10 implementation took more of their time, and this has been put on the back burner because we really don't have that much more, and they haven't even come forward with examples to help clarify things. The XE modifier is a separate encounter for a service that's distinct because it occurred during a separate encounter on the same day. The XS is a separate structure, and that is also a distinct service because it was performed on a separate organ or structure. XP is a separate practitioner, and that represents a service that is distinct because it was performed by a different practitioner. And then the XU, unusual non-overlapping service, and is the use of a service that is distinct because it does not overlap usual components of the main service, which still nobody seems to understand. It's a little bit, I don't know, ambiguous to me. Any of these codes, whether it's 59 or the X modifiers, documentation must support a different session, surgery, or procedure. Okay, can you move that up a little, the slide? Right, I could talk. Or any of encounters on the same day. Some of the facts are X modifiers 59 and the X modifiers are never to be appended to an E&M code, only procedures or services. CMS will continue to recognize modifier 59 in many instances and be selective when requiring the X modifiers where specific procedures represent a higher risk for coding abuse or CMS overpayment. That I have not seen happen, but I would anticipate somewhere in the near future it will. You only want to use modifiers if they adhere to the National Correct Coding Initiative status indicators. And that is, okay, can you move that up? One, meaning that the codes can be billed with modifiers 59 or X EPSU on column 2 code, and the 0 status indicator means it can never be billed together. And basically that is that they are used on the second and additional procedures on a claim form. So the very first procedure on the claim form would never ever show a modifier 59 or X code. It's always the lesser valued procedure. And with column 2 procedure codes, they're listed in the National Correct Coding Initiative. So if it doesn't say if it says 1, then you can, add the modifier 59 or any of the X modifiers to the second column procedure code. And you also would use them if there was no other acceptable modifier. And I'll show that as we move forward, what that would mean. You never want to code a modifier 59 and an X modifier on the same procedure code and on the same date of service on a claim form. And that's CMS's rules. I happened to see some blurb on a Blue Shield of one of the Carolinas, and it said you should have them both together. So we're focusing on CMS, but I cannot stress enough that if you venture forth into these other payers, make sure you know what their guidelines are. And if a more appropriate modifier can be used opposed to a 59 or the X modifiers, by all means use it. So in other words, if a modifier 50 is more appropriate, you would use that as a bilateral instead of listing the procedure twice with a modifier 59 or X on the second procedure. XE, the separate encounter, is exactly that. It's distinct because it occurred during a separate encounter on the same date of service. And I extracted different examples from different payer sites and from Medicare and just different places, just to give you an example. And a physician performs a cardiovascular stress test and also a rhythm ECG at a different encounter on the same day. What I did is I took these two procedure codes and I used supercoder.com and I entered them into the system. And what came forward was the CCI validation saying that the code 93040, which is the ECG, is a column 2 code for 93015. So if it was appropriate, you could add a modifier to code 93040. And I'm sure the other softwares do it as well, but with Supercoder, it will tell you with an asterisk, you would attach the modifier X to the 93040. And if you move down, you'll see the, down a little bit, this is what they gave, this is what they give you on Supercoder. These are all the related modifiers, so that if for any reason, any one of these, whether it's left, right, TA or T1 for a toe, whatever, that takes precedence. But in this case, the XE would work. So you would use 93015 first, and then the second column code 93040 with an XE. Okay, the next example is the XP, and this is basically, it's very basic. It's 2 services or procedures performed by 2 different practitioners on the same date of service in a group using the same tax ID number. It does not have to be at the same encounter. One could be in the morning, one in the afternoon, and they don't even have to be the same specialty, but they can be. XS is a separate structure, which is pretty self-explanatory, and that is a service that is distinct because it was performed on a separate organ or structure. As an example, a complex repair of the forehead measuring 2.5 centimeters, as well as a complicated incision and removal of a foreign body subcutaneous tissue in the arm. When I entered these 2 CPT codes, the 13131 and the 10121, Supercoder came out with a CCI saying that 13131 is a column 2 code for 10121, and you would add the modifier to the 13131, the X modifier, the XS, and then you can just see it as we move up. You can see the example on the next page, I guess. Here, the 10121, and then you would append the 13131 XS. And again, if any of these other codes applied, if they happen to apply, you could use that instead of the XS, but this is definitely a good example of how that would work. The XU, the unusual non-overlapping service, is a service that is distinct because it does not overlap usual components of the main service. I'll tell you, I've seen so many examples and none of them make sense to me, so I used this one. And I don't know, laparoscopy, surgical ablation of one or more liver tumors, radiofrequency, and then ultrasonic guidance for needle placement. Example, biopsy, aspiration, injection, localization device, imaging, supervision, and interpretation for phlebitis and thrombophlebitis of superficial vessels of the right lower extremity. When I put these codes in, 76942 was the column 2 code for the 47370, and it did say to append it to the 76942. But I wanted to stress that one of the things that I did see that jumped out at me, and I saw 2 similar examples of this, is that if the 76942 was related to the laparoscopic liver tumor ablation, no modifier would have been required. You would add the modifier if it was unrelated to the laparoscopic liver tumor ablation. And honestly, everyone that gave these examples, with XU in particular, have complained that Medicare has not given one example to allow consultants or anyone to really get a handle on what this means. So I apologize if it's not coming across clear, but I spent a lot of time trying to find something that was clear-cut on this particular modifier. And since I had 2 of them similar, I used this one as an example. But I'm waiting, and the day that I see it, I'll make sure that it shows up on the webinar, even if we touch on that XU. But for now, that's really the best that I could do. And lastly, I had just one final thing, is something to think about when you're actually coding and using these X modifiers, that if a physician excised 2 cysts on a left breast on the same day, you know, what would you use a modifier 59? And the answer would be no, because the diagnosis code is for a male or a female, not diagnosis, CPT code is for a male or female, one or more lesions. And there's no distinct modifier required because it's in the description of the CPT. However, if it was 2 cysts on a left and a right breast on the same day, would we use an XS, modifier 50 bilateral, or left or right? Because that is 2 structures, it's the left breast and the right breast. But in this case, as I had mentioned earlier, this modifier 50 would take precedence over the XS, because in the guidelines it states that that code, you would report a modifier 50 for bilateral cases, and it's right there in the guidelines of CPT. So in summary, coders have to remain diligent on their quest for the correct use of these X modifiers. Many payers and Medicare contractors do not offer solutions, nor do they accept the X modifier in certain or all cases. And as I had mentioned, one of the Blue Shields in the Carolinas said they wanted a 59 with an XS on the same line. And coders who had asked about my examples the last time I presented this a year ago, in Massachusetts, my Blue Shield plan, the scenario that I offered was actually accurate, but in Medicare and in other cases it wasn't, and that's why we came back and revisited the X codes, because there really is a lot of different questions out there, and Medicare has yet to come forward and really help coders and other companies, you know, understand it better. So for now, we just do our homework, and when things really start happening, we'll be able to address it again. And that's it. All right.
All right, thanks, Joanne. That was good. So basically, modifier 59 is the modifier of last resort. That still applies for the X modifiers if there's something better.
Yes, and some of the contractors for Medicare don't even acknowledge the X modifier yet, and other contractors do. So it really, the coder has to look at their contractor for Medicare to see if they'll accept it. 59 works, but those X's, it's iffy right now. And I'm sure that will change, but right now there really isn't much difference than from last year.
Okay, great. Thank you.